Okay, today I'm in Lancaster with Andy Gibson. Thanks so much for agreeing to talk to us today, Andy.
My pleasure.
Rather than me do it, just please describe what you do for a living.
I suppose professional punter, have been for many, many years. And over the last couple of years in particular, well, actually since 2010, branched out a little bit, started doing a little bit for At the Races, but that was sort of a once a year video preview for the Cheltenham Festival, a few written previews for them for the festivals. Last couple of years I've branched out a little bit and done a little bit for William Hill Radio, Racing UK, which is now Racing TV, and I've been running a service for Weatherby's called Andy Gibson's Notes on the Clock for maybe a couple of years. Yeah.
Okay, so you've got quite a few irons in the fire, but you've been a professional punter for how many years?
I would say a winning professional punter. It's funny that actually I went for a massage with my osteopath, and there was he has a young woman who was an assistant, and she asked him what I did for a living, and he said, "Oh, he's a professional gambler." She said, "Oh, that's interesting." He said, "Because if you win, you're a professional gambler, and if you lose, you're an addict." So I'm just about on the end of professional gambler, but maybe once upon a time that would, in her words, that would, by her definition, that would have made me an addict. So maybe since 90-ish, 91, something like that, whatever that is. What's that, 30 years?
So what's your edge?
I think devotion to the work is a big help. Since my first son was born in 29 years ago, and I remember thinking, as soon as he was born, I remember thinking, right, I don't want my whole life to evolve around betting. So from 29 years ago, I knocked the flat on the head in terms of really intimate study and long hours. And I decided that the summer was for my son, and then 2 years later I had another son, so the summer was for my children and the winter was for work. So I now work extremely long hours in the winter. It's not just about hard work, because I'm sure there's many people could work long hours and not get anywhere, but I do think as a starting point, I think being prepared to work many hours through the winter. I work every day, rarely would take a full day off. But in terms of edge, you know, these are the specifics we get up to. I think I know you've talked to a friend of mine, Andy Holding, before, and he's very good through his speed figures. I prefer time comparisons of different races on the same day. I look at them in great detail, and I time a lot of horses from hurdle to hurdle, so that the race tells me a story in comparison to another race. I enjoy that sort of story. So, for example, I'm trying to think of a decent example. An example would be Apple's Jade returning to race over 2 miles, and then there's the big hoo-ha recently for the Cheltenham Festival. Is Apple's Jade now a 2-miler? Isn't she a 2-miler? Well, on that day, Jet Ski was running in the handicap hurdle that followed, and his time from 3 out to the winning line actually matched. He was much quicker than Super Sunday. He admittedly started behind him, but he made up 3 or 4 seconds on Super Sunday. So at the point that Apple's Jade was drawing miles clear of Super Sunday and looking extremely sexy, at the same time, Jet Ski, an 11-year-old rated 145, was making up a similar amount of ground on Super Sunday. And actually, if you put the 2 races side by side, Jet Ski would have finished either 2nd or 3rd in that race. I thought that put quite an interesting marker on the form, because what I like to do is, when you see an incredibly sexy performance like an Apple's Jade, I think the first thing to ask is, what if that's not quite right? You know, so we have a very recent example, Min. Min has just won by 20 lengths was it at Aintree, beating Politilog by 20 lengths. And you know, if you judge Min purely on that run, well, who's going to beat him? Who's going to beat him in the future if he's 20 lengths better, etc., etc. But I think there's plenty of evidence on the table to suggest that there's not an awful lot between Min and Politilog on another day. And I think, for example, my view of Aintree would be that the ground conditions on that day were such that it favoured front runners massively, and that Min enjoyed an untroubled lead all the way through the race, and therefore was able to look as impressive as he's ever going to do. So I love performances like that, because you know every pundit, race reader is going to eulogise about how brilliant it was. But of course we're not going to make any money if that's all we think, because Min, the one thing for certain is Min is going to be a shorter price next time than he should be. Whatever that means, he's going to be a shorter price than he should be. And so that would be my starting point.
So these hours that you spend, would you be then looking back at the race in its entirety rather than just the horse's form? Is that the way you would delve?
Yeah, I would. I look at my starting point really is that I from October onwards, I watch all the decent meetings. I tend not to watch meetings Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So I'll watch all the decent meetings Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And then it takes me 3 days, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, to re-watch all of the races and make comprehensive diary notes on all of those, on every horse that I'm interested in all those races. It takes me probably 30 hours a week work to re-watch the races and make those notes. Those diary notes I then put into the Proform Racing Notes Importer, and then at the moment Simon Walton from Proform, from when I need tomorrow's racing notes, he just sends me at 3 o'clock the day before. So my starting point every day is I get sent my diary notes, and on the morning then, or the evening before, I start looking through my diary notes in relation to the race in front of me.
You were telling me earlier that a big proportion of your annual winnings at the Cheltenham Festival. So why do you specialise in such what looks like difficult racing?
I specialise in the top end of racing. I've gone a little bit further down the scale recently since doing the notes on the clock service for Weatherby's and one or two other things, and also being involved in one or two horses that are slightly lower down the scale. So, but I've always sort of followed. My website's called the Cheltenham Trail. That's only been going 3 or 4 years, but I've always kind of followed the Cheltenham Trail, which is all the races from October through to March, which are basically the pattern races, all the graded races. I've always followed them. I kind of feel I know them inside out. I feel I can understand and very easily be able to put performance into context from one of those races into the next week or 3 weeks later, whatever it is. And it culminates with the Cheltenham Festival. The fact that sometimes the Cheltenham Festival is responsible for 40%, 50% of my annual winnings is just, I have had maybe 6 out of the last 9 or 10 festivals that have been particularly profitable. And that's because I follow, quite often do an awful lot of each way multiple bets at the festival. The key to those is getting a quarter of the odds. And once upon a time, everybody was giving a quarter of the odds. And nowadays it's few and far between, but you can still get a quarter of the odds if you shop around. And then what I tend to do is, if, you know, for example, I'll give you an example at this year's Cheltenham Festival. I'll give you a losing example. I'd hate to just, you know, blow my trumpet and give a winning, so it's better to give a losing example. I had probably my largest bet at the festival this year was an each way double. Bouverdare 11-4 for the champion hurdle, with Paisley Park 2-1, 9-4 for the stayers hurdle. Short price double, but I thought it was really strong. One of the reasons was the Apples Jade time figure. That would be a tiny part of the jigsaw puzzle. Another reason was the Lorena time figures. When Lorena ran at Sandown in her last but one start before the festival, on that day she was the slowest of all of the 4 hurdle races, even though she only had one opponent and she was able to run round in her own time. Now, yes, she ran half a mile further than the other 3 races, but actually when you look at the video, she just jogged round and had the race run completely to suit her. And if you're looking at an 11-4 shot, which she was at the time for the champion hurdle, I think you don't want just a horse to look really sexy in winning. You want something to support that on the clock, I think. And that certainly wasn't the case. So there was some substance to backing Bouvardere. Obviously, he'd won it twice before. I don't think he was 100% when he won it the previous year. I wasn't concerned at all about his Kempton defeat to Verdana Blue. I thought that was a sprint from the third last hurdle to the line. I think that race was something like 10 seconds slower than when he won it the previous year. The faster ground would have been massively in favour of Verdana Blue. So there was a lot in his favour, and of course he's fallen at the third hurdle. He's never fallen in his life. I don't think you can allow for that. You can't, it'd be very, very hard to say before the festival, I don't think Bouvardere is going to get round. But the key to the bet was that if Bouvardere had been placed, then I could have traded out in the place market on Paisley Park. So all you're requiring is for Bouvardere to finish in the first three, which if he'd have stood up, I think most people would think that he would have either won or come a close second. That would be my guess. All he had to do was finish in the first three, and then you can't lose on the bet. So you can afford to put an awful lot more money on because you're asking very little to actually return your stakes. And so on those short priced each way doubles, I guess that's what I'm asking. I'm looking for circumstances where I require very little. So the other big each way double I did was Bouvardere at 11-4 and Benny de Jure at 11-8. And obviously we all know how that ended up. But once again, if Bouvardere had been finished third, then I would have, I could trade out on Benny de Jure in the place market and couldn't possibly lose on the bet and made sure that I won a small amount of money, whatever happened. So I do a lot of that sort of stuff. When you're looking at trebles and fourfalls, it's just the key is at what point do you step in and start trading something in the place market. And I'd rather lay them in the place market generally if I can, because I don't want to impact upon the big win if I get it, because that's the difference between a massively successful season and an okay season or a good season.
How do you manage to get these sort of bets on? Because they're not the sort of bets bookmakers really like, are they?
No, maybe not. But I can't get them on myself. I haven't. That would have been. It's like that's the same for many people I know. I don't think even nowadays you even need to be a successful punter not to get your bets on. I think you just need to not look profitable for the bookmaker. Or I remember I won't name the bookmaker because it would be unfair, but I had opened an account. I had 6 bets with this bookmaker. They all finished almost last. They ran absolutely abysmally, but all 6 of them were shortened in the market before the race. And the bookmaker closed my account because he thought I was arbing. And I wasn't. I was just successfully losing. I mean, they were just rubbish. All 6 of them were absolutely terrible. And they closed my account. Now, I'm sure that's a story that many people will be familiar with. You can get once upon a time, it was kind of like a golden badge to say, I've had my account closed. It's not the case now, is it? You get your account closed for very little reason. So I have a team, a group of people, a group of friends that will put bets on for me. How big that group is will depend upon how big I'm betting that season. And that will change season to season depending on what else I'm getting up to, and it generally works better when you've got very few people putting on, because the more people that are putting on for you, the more that can go wrong, the more chance of you being let down. And let's face it, with most people doing that job for you, it's more often than not it's going to end in tears somewhere along the line.
Do you build up an ante-post portfolio along the way, or is that something you don't delve into?
My first bet of this festival was over Christmas, and this was on the Cheltenham Trail. So I prepared a preview for the Challow Hurdle at Newbury. And on the morning of the race, I had 2 choices. I didn't really want to be getting stuck into Champ at even money, so I recommended a bet on Champ for the Ballymore at 10-1 on the morning of the race, with a view to getting out or having the option of getting out 24 hours later if you wished, if he won as impressively as I hoped he was going to. So obviously that became a possibility.